The movie Gods and Generals, is it historically correct? Let's find out.
A few moments later.
Okay, let's look at the movie Gods and Generals. After speedrunning the movie, taking notes on the movie, and looking at the sources, I finally am back to you guys. The movie Gods and Generals is a Civil War drama. It is directed by Robert Maxwell. The movie was greatly criticized for being a little bit sympathizing tribute to the Confederacy and a lost cause theory. Does this movie offer historically correct content? My answer is yes. I believe it does. In fact, this movie is almost a video textbook on the military history and the Civil War. In some ways, it could be considered a biography of Thomas Jackson. He was a military genius, he was a great strategist, and the right-hand man of Robert E. Lee. Even though Lee and Jackson led the Confederate Army, one cannot deny the success of their partnership. The relationship between Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson is described by Christian in his handbook, The Great Partnership, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the Fate of the Confederacy. He explains that it is proof that the command relationship between the chief leader and the chief advisor is supremely important because it is within the boundaries of the association and the best strategic ideas. Every senior leader needs a trustworthy advisor. When the relationship is founded on personal friendship or religious faith, it is strengthened. And when it is absent, the implications can be grave. This movie was not a box office success. It was highly criticized for the lack of its portrayal. Slavery, the director wanted to pay super close attention to more of the military details when creating this movie. He was obsessed with the realism of the war and of the Civil War. He hired reenactment actors to create the battle scenes. In fact, during the Fredericksburg battle scene, he insisted the Union troops cross a pontoon bridge instead of choosing the much less expensive and historically inaccurate option of fording the river. One of the main criticisms in the movie is its lack of attention to institution slavery. There are very few scenes with African Americans, and those that do appear in the movie are slaves that are grateful for their owners, ready to fight for their southern homes. In the movie, Stonewall Jackson hires a black man as a cook. It was a special relationship between the two men, and it seems to blossom throughout the movie, but however, there is no evidence or documentation that this relationship between the two actually existed. Now let's take a look at the relationship between Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Their relationship can be considered something like Batman and Robin. They were a dynamic duo. In fact, many have thought that if Jackson would have lived longer, that the Civil War would have ended differently and may have a different result at the end of Gettysburg. Jackson has been an inspiration to many military leaders such as George Patton and Douglas MacArthur. According to SS Patton, Jackson and Lee had a great deal in common. They were both from Virginia and taught at military universities. Jackson studied Napoleon and his military strategies, which might explain how he himself is his own military genius. That is located on page 90. He was very religious, which was portrayed throughout the movie. Robertson suggested in his writing that Jackson thought the war as a religious crusade and viewed himself like David or Joshua from the Old Testament. SS Patton reveals that Jackson was so successful because of his attention to detail in preparation of the war, which can be located on page 98. This can be seen in the movie during the battle planning between Jackson and Lee. Jackson and Lee had a unique bond and thought alike in many different ways. They were so much alike that they could fill in details of what the other person was thinking. Lee trusted Jackson so much that he would follow him blindfolded. Jackson was also very secretive of his plans and often kept his subordinates out of the loop until the very last minute. This can be seen in the movie right before his famous battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville. All right, now I have historical proof in the battles that were in the movie. The first battle that was in the movie, we have Battle of Bull Run. This is the battle that Stonewall Jackson got his name, Stonewall Jackson. In the movie, the Confederacy was being pushed back near defeat when one of the generals, I believe his name was General Barnard E., he railed his men to look towards Jackson, and Jackson was holding his ground like a stone wall. That can be located on page 302. The Confederate soldiers railed and won the battle. From here on out, Thomas Jackson was known as Stonewall Jackson. Also, throughout the movie, Jackson appears to be humbled by the name, and on more than one occasion, he states that his men earned him that name. The Battle of Fredericksburg, proof can be found in Earl Hess's article, Field of Armies and Fortifications in the Civil War, the Eastern Campaigns from 1861 to 1864. The Confederates became masters of building fortifications as they fended from the Union Army, led by Burnside, that is located on page 170. And because of the errors, Burnside had to wait for pontoon bridges to arrive. In the movie, Union General Hancock begged Burnside to attack Lee while he was trying to prepare, but he denied his request because he chose to wait for the bridges. Because of this delay, Hancock predicted a very bloody battle across the field. In the movie, the battle with the Union soldiers being shot at as they tried to build the pontoon. The battle eventually moves into streets of Fredericksburg, with the CSA and the citizens taking refuge in the nearby woods and hills while the Union soldiers looted the town. This is noted on page 166 in Earl Hiss's book. There were also Irish fighting on both sides during the battle, and can be documented later in a letter from the American Catholic Researches. The movie depicted the guilt that the Irish had about fighting their own people. The Battle of Fredericksburg, the scenes can be described as authentic. They have lack of blood and gore that would have been in the present during the actual thing. According to Hess's book, when the Confederate Army returned to Fredericksburg after the victory, they discovered a massive amount of dead and wounded behind a wooden fence and inside a stone house. The actual location was supposedly horrific with blood and gore, but was later thrown away in the movie. It was in fact very little blood, very little gore, and was seen throughout the whole 4 hours of the movie. During the movie, Lee's men had to build walls. These walls and fortifications were built with stone and dirt. Hess's note that Lee's extreme fortification led to everyone seeing the importance of fortifying supply stores, and they used the civilian buildings as fortifications. That can be located on page 171 of Hess's book. The movie portrays a human side of Stonewall Jackson. In the movie, Jackson grows close to this little girl named Jan. She was about 5 years old and the daughter of a soldier. Jackson let the girl play in his office, gave her piggyback rides, and even gave her the braid of his army hat. The proof can be found in the Confederate Veteran Magazine, Volume 20 in 1912. In the article called Stonewall Jackson in the Winter Quarters, that was located on pages 24 and 26. The article quotes the child's mother, Roberta Corbin, from a letter she wrote. Her letter documents the exact events in the movie and describes how Jackson often played with the little girl and the rest of the children. When the children got sick from scarlet fever, he sent his personal doctor to take care of them. Now, in the movie and in the actual thing, Jan eventually does pass away, and it does affect Jackson. He cried about it for a long time, and he would separate him from his troops to shed tears about it. Moving on to the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Battle of Chancellorsville was Lee's most perfect battle and a significant win to the Confederacy. Lee and Jackson were huge risk takers. Lee decided to split his army up and attack from multiple sides to defeat a much larger army, which was the Union Army. The movie portrays this battle correctly. SS Patson writes about Jackson's last charge in his most famous military flank, where the CSA caught the Union forces by surprise and won the battle. As nighttime started to fall, Jackson and some of his men were doing a recon movement when they were fired upon by their own men. Jackson was wounded and had to have his arm amputated. Now, however, 8 days later, he dies of pneumonia. This event and Jackson's death is documented in Patson's biography. Charles Rowland writes in his book, History Teaches Us to Hope, the partnership of General Lee and General Stonewall were one of the most spectacular command combinations in history. I know them, or I like to think of them as a good team like Batman and Robin. Many of the scholars from both South and the North have often wondered if Jackson had not have died, if the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Civil War, or even the Battle of Gettysburg would have a different outcome. Since the Battle of Gettysburg was a defeat for the Confederacy and a turning point for the war. Rowland goes on to state that the Lee-Jackson combination was a synergetic relationship in which the effect of the whole exceeded that of its parts. One of Lee's most famous quotes is found in the movie and in Rowland's book. Upon learning of Jackson's injury and his death, Lee said he lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. That is located on page 248. He had no idea how to replace him, and it showed. The war went on for 2 more years, but following the death of Jackson, Lee nor the Confederacy would never be the same. Now, in conclusion, the movie Gods and Generals is spot on for being historically correct, especially for its military maneuvers and the people that were involved. The first hour starts off kind of slow and seems to glorify in so-called romance of the South. It lacks a lot of blood and guts, especially when compared to modern war movies with their advanced CGI and effects. It doesn't seem to show the true number of casualties that had occurred during the Civil War. It lacks attention to slavery issues and passiveness of the few African American characters that were in the movie. It's a little bit of a drawback and could have lower authenticity. However, to study and learn about the partnership of Lee and Jackson, it is a worthy source.
Go to Gaping if you want to go.
What the hell? Let me get my shoes on. Okay.